Hi everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar, Free Yourself with the 4 Stages of Codependency Recovery. First of all, before we get any further, could you please raise your hand if the audio sounds is difficult for you, or if you're having any problems hearing me, and I'll turn up the volume. No. Okay, looking good. So my name is Zoe Kessler, and I'll be your host this evening on behalf of psychcentral.com. Before we introduce tonight's presenter, I'd like to remind you that you will be able to access the complete webinar online at Psych Central's YouTube channel later this week. If you haven't already checked it out, Psych Central has videos and webinars on a wide variety of mental health topics with guest speakers from many disciplines. During tonight's webinar, please feel free to ask any questions by typing them into the question area on your control panel. We will try to answer everyone's questions, but we'll also do our very best to wrap up within the hour. So, I'm very, very happy to say that my guest tonight is Ross Rosenberg, a codependency psychotherapist and professional trainer. He's also the owner of Clinical Care Consultants in Arlington Heights, Illinois. And he is the author of The Human Magnet Syndrome, a popular bestseller on Amazon.com. Tonight, Ross will present his compact and revolutionary 4-stage codependency treatment model and his Surgeon General's codependency recovery warning. Both were developed as a direct result of his own codependency recovery and 27 years of working with codependent clientele. These new and innovative codependency recovery concepts have been met with universally positive feedback from both professionals and non-professionals alike. So, without further ado, let's welcome our special guest. Ross, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Zoe, so much for having me be a part of this webinar.
You are very welcome, and I am just going to throw this over to you so that we can see your screen, and we'll have your presentation followed by the question and answers. Okay. There we go.
Okay. Well, let's begin. Well, first of all, for those who are listening, I can't tell you how pleased I am to talk about this aspect of my work with codependence. It has been a long time coming. I've been talking about why codependents are attracted to certain type of individuals, mainly narcissists, through a lot of my trainings and my book, and now it's time for me to talk about what to do and how to do it. And to begin, it's important for me to define what exactly is codependency. It has been around, the term codependency has been around probably since the mid-1980s, traces back all the way back into the 60s, but there are so many different meanings and definitions for the disorder. And for me to talk about what are the stages of codependency recovery or treatment, let's start with an acceptable definition. First, codependency is an individual disorder that is expressed in relationships. You can't be codependent, or codependency does not manifest unless you are connected to another person. A codependent or codependency is not a personality type. If we find ourselves using these derogatory, pejorative terms, she's needy, or he, is lonely or pathetic, and we somehow connect that to codependency. But that's the furthest from the truth. There are so many different types of codependence, and it's important for us to know that codependency comes in different forms and shapes. The most simple definition that I have, which I created for my book, The Human Magnet Syndrome, is codependence, hyper-focus on giving love, respect, and care freely and abundantly to others, while undervaluing, dismissing or not demanding the same from their partners. Codependents want an equal distribution of love, respect, and care, or I call LRC, but they don't know how to get it. And that is what ties them into the relationship, is they want it to be equal and mutual. They're with a person that is unable to reciprocate or be mutual. They resent that person and they maintain a relationship. So codependency then simply is someone who in relationships gives a much more love, respect, and care to others while not getting the same from their partner, being upset about it, and staying in the relationship. In an effort to explain more about codependency, I came up with two categories, and one is an active codependent and a passive codependent. One is more resigned. You know, I think of the character Edith Bunker in All in the Family that is resigned and kind of goes with the flow. And the active codependent pursues the narcissist, pursues the addict, pursues people, tries to control them, but both share the same psychological and relational traits, is that they stay in relationships and where they freely and abundantly give to others while not getting the same. So now that we have a definition of codependency, it's important to say that codependency is a word that is overused and can be harmful in the way that people use it. I've actually had a discussion just recently with Melody Beattie, who is the author of at least 9 or 10 books on codependency, including the Codependency No More, and we both talked about codependency as kind of, the term has kind of morphed into a stereotype. And one of the things that I emphasize in my trainings and my writings is that codependents are individuals that have problems in which they feel stuck, hurt, and ignored. It's important to recognize that these are folks who have a disorder. Although it's not recognized in the DSM, they are individuals who are struggling to find love, respect, and care, but can't find it. It makes me sad and sometimes frustrated to know that people use the term codependent as a pejorative, negative term that often carries a stigma. So in the process, of coming up with a treatment strategy for codependents, I found that if I didn't warn them of the challenges ahead, they might drop out of therapy. And I find that it's important morally and ethically for therapists to tell their codependent client that there is a lot of negative situations and experiences ahead if you pursue codependency recovery. So one day I came up with I used the term the Surgeon General's warning. And of course we know on the pack of cigarettes that if you smoke, the Surgeon General says you're going to get lung cancer, heart disease, emphysema, and you probably will die early. Well, that is a warning that gives the person a choice, an opportunity to make a choice. Do they want to smoke, or should they not? Well, similarly, in my sessions with codependents, I explain that if you continue in this path of codependency recovery, a lot of negative things are going to happen. A lot of challenges are going to happen. You are going to experience some of the worst emotional and psychological pain that you probably have experienced in your life. I believe the client deserves to know what's ahead of them, because if we are going to bring them past these huge obstacles in recovery, we have to prepare them with the worst part, the most difficult part, or the challenging part of codependency recovery. Therefore, the Surgeon General's warning, as I call it, helps our clients reach a very informed decision. It creates the very framework for the recovery work. it helps the client participate in a cost-benefit proposition. It is through the early discussions, through the Surgeon General warning discussions, they get to choose if they want to pursue codependency recovery. It creates realistic expectations. For example, and I'll go through this in just a few minutes when I talk about the 4 stages of codependency recovery. But early on, there are going to be a lot of negative consequences early on in the initial stages of codependency recovery. Not only should the client know about that, not only do they deserve to know about that, but they need to make an informed decision. Because with that information, we can motivate and inspire them. The therapist can motivate and inspire our clients to do the work. We realistically prepare them for the fight of their life. So I say to all the folks out there who are struggling with codependency that when a therapist prepares you for the fight of your life, for your decision to recover from codependency, you are building a partnership with your therapist who's going to be honest and not hold back any negative repercussions or results from this process. You're going to be prepared for your adversaries. You're going to be prepared for all the people who are going to be really angry and upset and disappointed. See, the Surgeon General warning anchors codependence in the recovery process by starting them off with factual information of what happens when you decide to no longer subjugate yourself to passivity, where you no longer decide to be invisible in relationships. So all in all, my Surgeon General warning is used to prepare my codependents realistically for what comes next. When I give the Surgeon General's warning, it's so important that I understand that people are scared. And all of you out there who struggle with codependency, I know you're scared. I know that you really want to set boundaries. You really want to be loved. You really want to say, stop that. But you also need to know that if you start to do what you've always dreamt you should do and believe you need to do, it's going to be difficult. It's like a hip replacement, for example. There's a guy that works with me, fantastic therapist. He was in so much pain, but did not want to go to the doctor for his hip replacement. And finally, his doctor told him, he said, you know, Richard, it's going to hurt like hell. You're going to be in surgery. You're going to be in recovery. You're going to have physical therapy, and you're going to wish that you never had it, and you're going to want to quit. You might even beg to not have this done. But if you go through it, after a while, a short while, the positives, the positives for the surgery or the positives for codependency recovery is going to pay off. I've been working with codependents for over 27 years, and I've seen all of them start off in this first stage of fear and anxiety, but they get through it. And part of the Surgeon General warning is to explain not only what will happen and how difficult it will be, but to tell all of you that the payoff is worth it, that there is another side to all the anger and all the resentment caused by you finally being healthy in the way that you behave or react in your relationships. So what I've decided to do while I was creating this book, the Human Magnet Syndrome, is I wanted to explain how to change our propensity to always fall in love with the wrong person. The codependents, as I say in my book, seem to always fall in love with narcissists or addicts. And that information in the book was helpful to many people, helpful to understand the problem, the nature of the problem. But what do you do next? What happens once you decide to work on codependency? when you approach it like some people approach an addiction, a problem that is out of control, a problem that has taken most of aspects of your life and turn them into situations and relationships that can't be controlled, that are intolerable and causing a great amount of pain. So what I did was I created 4 stages, and I believe 4 very accurate stages for codependency recovery. Each stage is time limited, and as I go through each stage, I will tell you the typical time, the time involved in each stage, but I have to say that no one individual is the same. For some people, stage 1 might last 4, 5, 6 months. For many of my clients, it takes them a year to get to stage 1. So when a lot of us who are in the addiction field, we talk about the 12 steps, but no one talks about the unofficial 0 step. The 0 step is that step where you have to figure out and admit that there's a problem, that you actually have a name for the problem. That leads you to get help, and sometimes it leads you to go into the 12-step groups. But to get to stage 1, which is setting boundaries, this is when a client, a person, decides that they are ready. It is time for them to change the psychological and relational landscape of their life. Their therapist has already gone over the Surgeon General warning and explained the different stages of recovery. And I find it's very helpful to explain before we even begin stage 1 is to actually give the stages and talk about what's involved in them. Stage 1, 0 to 3 months, the hardest stage. This is what the Surgeon General warning was made for. Setting boundaries. Finally, telling people you've had enough. Finally, letting people know what you won't do anymore and what you will, and staying firm in those boundaries. Stage 2, 3 to 6 months. Maintaining these boundaries in a hostile environment. Now everyone's really angry at you. Your children, your spouse, people at work. You can go backwards and get off the recovery train, or you can stay on it and maintain yourself in this very difficult environment. Or stage 3, when you are building relationships, you're practicing new relationships. And then leads to stage 4, where you're reinforcing, strengthening your new relationships. And from there, your predilection, or what I call your magnetic tendency to be attracted to the same unhealthy, narcissistic type of person changes. And I call that the human magnet syndrome permanent shift. So let's talk about stage 1. It is the most difficult and challenging of them all. This is the stage that is analogous to being an alcoholic and quitting alcohol. It could be any addictive drug that has a difficult withdrawal syndrome. It is extremely anxiety provoking. People who go through this stage are afraid, scared to death, deal with depression and panic because they have worried their whole life about what would happen if they finally set boundaries. Many of my codependents never have, sadly, never have set boundaries with their loved ones or those who they work with, or their neighbors or friends. Setting boundaries for the first time with people who are narcissistic is very scary, because the truth is, in stage 1, the narcissists are going to be up in arms. They're going to be extremely angry. They're going to experience these boundaries as an attack upon them. What I teach often in my work with codependency is that codependents, of course, are attracted reflexively or magnetically to narcissists. Like a dance, you need one person you need the caretaker, you need the caregiver, and they both fit perfectly in this dysfunctional relationship that requires their opposite personalities to keep them together. But when you break free from that dance and you challenge the person and you say, I don't like that anymore, I need you to do this, the narcissist tends to not have the ability to accept fault in the problems. They tend to get very angry, they feel betrayed, and they blame the person who's blaming them. In other words, they can't see what's wrong with them, but they can always see what's wrong with other people. So in stage one, when you are setting boundaries for the first time, and you say, I want to go out with the girls, I want to go to a movie, you take the children to their swimming lessons. And this would be the first time that you've ever stood up to the narcissist and insisted that he or she do something that you normally would do. Always, the narcissist is going to be very angry, threatening. It could be overt or covert anger, or what I call emotional manipulation. It's very, very scary for the codependents in this stage, because they have never really experienced safety in speaking their truth. And the aggression, overt or passive aggression of the narcissist, is something that they've avoided their whole life. What I prepare my clients for in stage one is an immediate loss of friendships and relationships. And what I say is the people that love you and the people that don't love you are all going to be angry. And it sounds silly to them, but it's a fact. Those who love you and don't love you are going to be angry. What's going to happen in stage one is you won't be able to tell the difference. But there will be a separation of the two in the latter stages. Your children will be enraged. You'll tell them to put down their telephone and come to dinner or study. The very first time you set a boundary, they will treat you like you are a stranger. They will look at you with hatred. You are going to learn about very quickly what happens when a codependent finally sets boundaries and reasonable expectations, and immediately the world will seem like it's going to explode. So it's important that we prepare for immediate loss of friendships and relationships. We don't know if these relationships will be reconciled later, but it's important to prepare for that, because if you worry about a relationship being lost during stage one, it counteracts the importance of all of the processes and tasks necessary in this stage. It's important to manage these moments where you just feel like caving in, where you just say, enough's enough, I can't handle the constant threats and manipulation. You finally set these boundaries, and you just are going to be hit full force with the narcissist in your life wanting you to be this codependent that you used to be. You're going to feel isolated. You're going to feel alone, and worse yet, even lonely. Your friends and loved ones will be angry and resentful. You'll deal with criticism and condemnation, accusations. You're going to be told, paradoxically and unfairly, that you're being selfish. And that, to me, is the saddest accusation of all, that the codependent who has been selflessly connected to her loved ones or his loved ones, who has done everything for everybody, when they set boundaries, they're told that they're being selfish. But the reason that the emotional manipulators or the narcissists say that, it's because it has always worked before on codependents, starting back in their childhood, that if someone told this person who's either going to be a codependent or is a codependent, you're being selfish, that has always enticed the codependent to back down and to meet the needs of the emotional manipulator. I introduce a technique which I call the observe, don't absorb technique. And today I will not have time to go over it, and I welcome you to go onto YouTube. And I have a YouTube channel that has 50 of my videos, and most of the information that I talk about today and in other trainings is included there. But it's a very helpful technique to manage the onslaught of manipulation that happens in stage 1. To not get caught into the anger, the rage, and the forceful manipulation of all the people who are reacting to stage 1. This stage will only last about 3 months. So it is my goal, it's a therapist's goal, to keep the codependent strong and motivated and focused and help them manage the compulsions to acquiesce or give up. So then we move to stage 2. This is where the intensity of the conflict comes down a few notches. It's still very, very difficult. Stage 2 is maintaining boundaries in a hostile environment. You've already set boundaries, the important boundaries of things that you will or won't do anymore. You've spent 2-3 months of people being very angry, threatening you and trying to manipulate you to get you back to your codependent ways. But you've been strong, and you believe that you deserve to be loved and cared for in an equal proportion than you do for others. So what happens in stage 2 is those that don't love you, sadly, these could be your spouse, it could be your best friends, it could be people you've known your whole life, it could be even family members, they start to go away. I call this process separating the wheat from the chaff. In other words, this is when the narcissist cannot tolerate a relationship that is balanced to some degree of mutuality and reciprocity. And they decide that they can't be in a relationship like that, and they leave. Or the recovering codependent, moving beyond stage 1, starts to hold fast those boundaries, and the relationship ends. It's a very difficult stage, and it's a sad stage because relationships that you thought were loving, that you believed that were more loving and caring, they just break down. One of the hardest things that my clients struggle with is the realization that the relationships that they thought were important to them were only as good as them taking care of that person. And as soon as that codependency stopped, the relationships would not persevere. The narcissists go away. This is when we begin the grief work. This is where we talk to when I talk to my clients, and we talk about how much it hurts to have that best friend, that narcissist best friend, that indignantly, I can't pronounce my words tonight, sorry, with great indignation accused the codependent of being unreasonable and broke the relationship off. Or their parent, who when you set the boundary in stage 1 says they don't want to see you anymore. There's a lot of grief. And as in stage 1, when there are the withdrawal symptoms, as I call, again, using this, as a comparison to an addiction, the compulsions and the obsessions of wanting to give up the fight and go back to your old ways, they are reduced, but they're still problematic. But it's really important in stage 2 is to delineate between healthy and narcissistic relationships, because in this stage, this is where we are learning what is acceptable and what is not. When we can be patient, because it's not all or nothing. It's not that you get rid of all the narcissists and only keep the loving, healthy, balanced people. Well, that's unreasonable. During this stage, you have to figure out, well, what is fair? What level of reciprocity or mutuality is okay? How much empathy are you willing to give up? And in this stage, which lasts 30 to 60 days, 3 months to 6 months, I'm actually trying to put the screen down. Okay. It is important that the codependent acclimate to narcissistic injuries, guilt trips, shaming, and allegations of being selfish. And once they acclimate to it, once they get used to it, once they become familiar with the narcissist and the way that they manipulate, they start to predict it. They start to feel more confident. They have negative thoughts and fears. They have less thoughts and fears, and over time they become more and more confident. They set their boundaries without the fear of someone not wanting to be in a relationship with them. Because codependents previously, before their recovery work, they will not set a boundary because of their fear of being alone. In stage 2, the boundaries are set because they know that having a healthy relationship is far more important than the anxiety, fear, and grief in these stages. The next stage, and hold on one second, here we go. Stage 2 is, in this stage, it's really important to use the observe, don't absorb technique. Again, it's a technique that teaches the codependent that when you participate in the emotional manipulator's narcissism, they have control over you. That if you observe the controlling nature of the narcissist, instead of absorbing it or getting pulled into their drama, or analogous to if you let toxins inside of you when you get sick, that keeps you connected to your recovery and out of the manipulative strategies of the narcissist. And over time, the codependent acclimates to the loss of friends, loved ones, and relationships. They stay on top of depression, negativity, and pessimism. They fight the obsessions and compulsions to relapse, and they build a support network. So important, because therapy is not enough. A codependent has been alone, either literally alone or alone around people their whole life. And it's a loneliness that ties the codependent, or the fear of loneliness that ties the codependent into these relationships that are harmful to them. That is why building a support network, whether it's Codependency Anonymous, whether it's a church group, whether it's, a volunteer group, connecting to others is the solution to codependency recovery. So let's talk about stage 3. Stage 3 lasts for about 6 months. It's longer than both the first and the second stage. The first stage is where you set boundaries and everyone is angry and you doubt whether this was right, and you struggle with your own thoughts that it's worth it. Stage 2 is separating the wheat from the chaff, where you start to experience people disappearing, and you maintain your boundaries in hostile environments. But eventually, over time, the smoke clears, and the time for building relationships, of experimenting, comes to fruition. This is a time when there's a complete dissolution or end of the codependent narcissist relationship experience. The codependent no longer feels codependent. They no longer accept others unfairly, expecting more of them than they're willing to return. Their anxiety and fear of being alone and lonely starts to lessen. They start to experiment and reach out to those who are around, those who have survived the first 2 stages, and start to build upon these relationships. Some of these relationships reconfigure. Family members, they get over what is unfairly called selfishness. Now remember, there are people that threaten to leave the codependent in stage 1, and at this stage, some of them return. It doesn't mean that their narcissism has gone away. Is they just accepted that this person who now has more self-respect, who now sets more boundaries, who still to the narcissist is a pain in the rear, but they realize that they still want them in their life. So what we see is some of these narcissists return back and show the recovering codependent that they are more important to them than not to them. It's very satisfying to my codependent clients that at stage 3 they start to have people come back to them who promised them or threatened them that they never wanted to see them again. These relationships start to look more mutual, start to look more fair. There's more sharing, and the codependent in stage 3 is starting to experience, perhaps for the first time, the support and the giving and the respect that maybe they haven't experienced in their whole life. I call this a reconfiguration of the human magnet syndrome. And in my book I talk about how we are magnetically drawn, the codependents are magnetically drawn to the narcissist. But also healthy people are drawn to each other. So the healthy person who is giving and loving is not necessarily codependent. Well, they're going to be attracted to someone who's bold and maybe a little bit self-centered. Well, there's a reconfiguration of attraction patterns. You're no longer attracted to narcissists. You find yourself more turned off than attracted, and you start to find yourself more attracted to healthy people. During stage 3, we experiment with new relationships. We talk about, with our friends, what it's like to date someone that listens. I can't tell you the excitement that some of my clients talk about when they start to experience people that actually want to hear what they have to say, that actually do polite and kind things. When things don't go right in this stage, then narcissists reappear. The recovering codependent can detach easily. They're not pulled into the drama of the emotional manipulator or the narcissist. They spot it and they set the boundary, and when it doesn't work out, they remove themselves because they, up to this point, have had 6 months to a year of practice. Their painful episodes of loneliness are less frequent. And as I've said earlier, and in my other writings, loneliness is the key withdrawal symptom of codependency recovery. The codependent in the first stage of codependency recovery experiences deep bouts of loneliness that are painful. Those bouts are gone. And sometimes being alone feels good. Also, in stage 3, like any addiction, sometimes there's relapses. Sometimes the codependent loses their judgment or has a bad day or just something kind of goes wrong and they relapse and they connect with a narcissist. They go back to a lover. They quickly bounce back. They quickly realize that they can never really go back to the beginning because of all the progress they've made. Sometimes I find it's helpful to my clients to actually relapse because it shows them how far they've come and what is not acceptable anymore. Stage 4, the last stage, which is 1 year or longer, this is when your new relationship orientation has taken root. It's when reinforcing or strengthening new relationships. It's a very exciting time. Exciting for the therapist to see their former codependent client be happy and in love with people that can share as much as they take. There's a complete cessation or end of pathological caretaking. The relationships that they have are mutually loving, respecting, and caring. Now, it doesn't mean that it is equal all the time. No one has ever said that a relationship has to be equal. There just has to be a balance. The new relationships will be defined by a fair distribution of love, respect, and care. There will be healthy boundaries, boundaries that are open, that go both ways. There will be interdependence, and I love this word because interdependence means to be separate but connected. It's to have your own individuality but be connected to a relationship. I talk about this in an article I wrote for the Huffington Post called "Is Your Relationship Mathematically Sound?" about the importance of reciprocity and interdependence in a healthy relationship. During stage 4, loved ones will admire and affirm your growth and change. Unlike stage 1, where everyone is angry, all of a sudden people are admiring you. The funny element of this stage that both me and my clients often laugh at is the people who criticize them for being selfish in stage 1 or stage 2. They start to say how much healthier and stronger they seem. The critics have forgotten their complaints and feel closer to you. Relationships are balanced, and the cravings and withdrawal symptoms have stopped. Loneliness is gone. In fact, being alone might even be preferable. A recovering codependent in stage 4 is now repelled by narcissists. There's almost a reflexive reaction that when they are in a situation with a narcissist, something happens and shifts. They are immediately turned off by narcissists and turned on or excited by healthy prospective partners. As my dad once said, no more cellmates, just a soulmate. This is where love, the love that we dreamed of, can happen. Well, this was an introduction to my 4 stages, and I hope you appreciate it, and I would love to take questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Zoe.
Thank you so much, Ross. Can you hear me?
I can.
Fantastic. That was such a wonderful presentation, and I know that people are so interested in this topic. In fact, I have so many questions myself, but I must say that we have many questions from the attendees as well that I think we should just jump into them, and if there's room for me at the end, I'll ask my questions. Okay, so in no particular order, the first question that's come in is, can 2 codependents, and the questioner says male, female, but I live in Canada, so I need to include male, male, female, female. Can 2 codependents have a healthy, loving relationship?
My experience is 2 codependents are not attracted to each other. There is not that fluid magnetic attraction. You know, often people will talk about when they're either divorced and they're not in recovery and they're still codependent, and they're talk to me about their dating, and they'll say when they meet a codependent, there's no chemistry, there's no spark. So typically 2 codependents can have a friendship, but we don't see that pattern lasting in romantic relationships.
Okay, thanks. And I have to say there's a little bit of a buzz on the audio. I'm not sure why. It's not a big deal, but if there's something different on your end, anyway, lots of questions. So here's the next one, and I like this very much. Ross, are there some very specific instructions for setting boundaries available?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And that's about 3 months of therapy. The instructions is to start off with the observe, don't absorb technique, because that teaches the client to not get pulled into the manipulative strategies that the narcissist uses to break you down when you set boundaries. And I don't mean to be dismissive or try to like walk away from this question, but that literally could be an hour, a whole training or webinar in itself. And perhaps a good follow-up is, but clear boundaries and consistent clear boundaries. that's kind of what I'll say, and I apologize that I can't go into any deeper because I really want to get to other questions.
Okay, great, fair enough. Oh, here's a good one too. Is there a correlation between drug addiction and mental disorders such as bipolar depression with the narcissist?
Yes, there actually is, and I talk about this in my book, The Eamon-Magnus Syndrome. To understand pathological narcissism, we have to understand that an addict behaves narcissistically. And we cannot tell if they are narcissistic people and an addict, or just narcissistic because of the addiction until in recovery. So let's say someone is an alcoholic and they have stopped drinking for 4 months or 3 months and have been working a recovery program. And if they're still narcissistic, that means they both are narcissistic and an addict. But often, or maybe over 50% of the time at least, we find that some of the addicts who behave narcissistically aren't really narcissistic. Some might even be codependent in recovery.
Okay. Now, just to show you, Ross, that I was paying attention, our next question from one of our participants is, what makes a person codependent? And I'm fairly sure, correct me if I'm wrong, I heard you say that a fear of being alone was certainly a part of that, if not the whole thing. Am I right?
You are right, and the question is very complicated. What makes a person a codependent is a complicated experience of being a child to a narcissistic parent, during which in their formative years they learned that the way they get attention is by loving everyone else for fear of being alone. And so they learn really early on that they never get a chance to be loved unless they take care of someone else. And that whole sacrificing template is brought into adulthood. So that's kind of the beginning of codependency.
Wow. So if I might be so bold, it just calls to mind adult children of alcoholics. Does that mean that if you are an adult child of an alcoholic, for example, you would necessarily be codependent if you don't receive therapy? Or
what it means is if you're an ACOA or an ACA, an adult child of an alcoholic, it means that there's a high probability that you suffered as a child. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a codependent, but it can, because there's different types of alcoholics. There's mentally ill and abusive alcoholics, and then there's loving but harmful alcoholics. And so what creates codependency is that early childhood experience where you felt only lovable when you sacrificed your own needs and took care of others. And that can happen if one of your parents was an alcoholic, but doesn't always.
Okay, great. I guess we better move on. There's so many questions. It's great. I want to be very appreciative towards the participants. So, could stage 1 take longer if the narcissist lives far away? For example, a parent who lives in another state and you only see them a few times a year.
Yes, actually stage one can take longer, but it's not dependent on so much the narcissist. It's dependent on the codependent's boundaries. So for example, if the narcissist lives far away and they see them 3 or 4 times, there's still going to be connection with that narcissist in between the physical visits. There's going to be emails and phone calls, and all of the progress that is still being made about someone's codependency. But it is true that it takes longer when the primary relationships or the partner is not around, because you need time to practice and have experiences.
Right. Okay, great. Moving right along. Is it possible that the covert narcissist can recover as well as the codependent if he says he wants to?
Everything's possible if you're motivated to be honest and open and do the psychotherapy. It's my experience that covert narcissists who have a narcissistic personality disorder, which, by the way, it's like one of my biggest viewed YouTube videos. I think I've had 80,000 views on that video. Covert narcissism. They are manipulators. They play a role, and they are good at being the sheep in the wolf's. I mean, the wolf in the sheep's clothing. They will tell you whatever you want in order to try to get you to be the person they need. So, you know, So what really matters is what they do, and typically they will not stay in therapy, and they will only go just as far to try to get someone to believe they're going to change.
Okay. You mentioned your YouTube channel, Ross. Maybe when we're finished, you can tell us how to find that. Okay.
Okay, sure.
Okay, great. Do you offer weekend seminars for accelerated growth in now the person is in this area, and I'm not sure what area that is. So we're gonna pass on that one. I'm going to ask the person who asked that question to please define what area they're speaking about. So is there a link between narcissism and BPD and codependent relationships?
Absolutely. In fact, in my book, I talk about emotional manipulators or the pathological narcissist, and I include 3 disorders: narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder, and addicts. Those 3 disorders are the most narcissistic of all disorders. So there is a definite link between someone who's a borderline, who is a pathological narcissist, and being in a relationship with a codependent. We often see borderlines connected to codependence in relationships.
Oh dear. Okay, so just to be clear then, BPD is borderline personality disorder?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, thanks.
Thank
Here's another question. Why do former codependents who have broken free of their narcissist still feel the need to go back and please the narcissist from time to time?
You know, I often use codependency recovery, kind of analogous to addiction recovery. So we look at the alcoholic. We teach them that you're always an alcoholic and that you're always going to have moments of weakness where you're going to have cravings. Well, in my recovery work, I teach my codependent clients the similar concept, that you're going to have moments of weakness where you're going to feel that you should go back to or acquiesce to narcissists, and that's part of the recovery process, which is why therapy or 12-step groups and sponsors and other connections are so important to get past those humps in the road.
Okay. I have a question from someone about being married to a codependent for 20 years. If that person is still with us, if you have an actual question, it's not stated as a question, Ross, so I think I'm going to go through the rest of the questions and swing back around to this one if they want to ask their question. So how does a codependent know when they have reached a healthy place within their relationships, particularly if they find value in being needed by the narcissist and so think those dynamics indicate a healthy relationship?
Well,
what to do?
Well, in my book, I created a continuum of self-theory where I talked about healthy individuals and healthy attraction. And there are people who like to take care of others. They're not codependents. This is I'm a healthy personality type, and they tend to be connected to people who are more self-centered, and they're not necessarily narcissistic. So my point is, healthy people, healthy opposites are attracted to each other. But when we have a codependent who's in recovery that moves through these 4 steps, what happens is the relationship falls apart if the narcissist doesn't work with them and similarly get help. So the codependent no longer tolerates the narcissism. They find it very disturbing and upsetting, and the relationships tend to fall apart.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one. What is different in the presentation of someone with borderline personality disorder and a codependent individual?
Well, these are complete different disorders.
I'm sorry, could you say that again, Ross? There was a bit of a glitch in the audio.
Yeah, these
oh, that's much better.
Codependency and borderline personality disorder are completely different. I look at them as one as being a disorder that is mostly narcissistic, and one being a disorder that is mostly codependent. And they're not the same. And codependents often fall for someone who has borderline personality disorder because they stick around and they want to take care of that person who often hurts them and damages them, but later says they love them. Only the codependent seems capable of forgiving them over and over again and giving them another chance. The 2 are opposite. And in my book, I explain that in detail.
Okay, great. Okay, here's a good one. Do your 4 stages of codependency recovery methodologies for a codependent who's been in a relationship with a narcissist for over 30 years take much, much longer to realize recovery?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I talked about just for a moment this stage 0, and that's the stage that gets the person ready to do the work. And that sometimes is the longest stage, where I work with my client to build the courage to begin setting boundaries. And that takes sometimes anywhere from 2 months to a couple years.
Mm.
But once you are ready to, it's a bad analogy, pull the trigger, but no, once you are ready to to go through stage 1, it's not as long as you think, because that's where everything kind of falls apart. So the lengthy part of codependency recovery is getting to stage 1.
Okay, very good. Oh my goodness, we have so many. We're going to have you back. Here's one I believe, I don't know, they don't specify if it's from a psychotherapist, but here's the question. What advice can be given for codependent psychotherapists working with narcissistic clients?
Get into therapy. I myself am as a recovering codependent, and I promise everyone out there that my skill level exponentially increased as I got healthier and moved forward in my own codependency recovery. A codependent who's a therapist doesn't even know what they're blinded to, because you can't see in other people what you can't recognize in yourself. So working on yourself is the very best tool, better than any training or any book out there, and wonderful things will happen with your clinical work.
Okay. Oh my goodness, we've only got 3 minutes. Okay, one more. Does trauma bonding play a role in the narcissistic codependent relationships to influence the codependent person to return to codependent behavior?
Absolutely. In fact, Patrick Carnes wrote one of the best books on trauma bonding. Absolutely. And once we start talking about trauma bonding, we start to go into deeper psychodynamic trauma concepts. But it'll suffice to say that codependents and the narcissists play out the trauma they endured as a child. And part of that attraction phenomenon that happens in the human magnet syndrome really is a part of trauma bonding.
Oh, holy moly. Okay, so did you mention a book, Ross, that talks about trauma bonding?
Yes, Patrick Carnes wrote the seminal book on trauma bonding.
Okay, you know what? I think when we post the replay, sorry to interrupt, but we've only got 2 minutes and a few more questions. What I'll do, Ross, is I'll ask you for that title later, and we'll put that up with the video so people can access it, along with the URL for your YouTube channel.
Sounds good to me.
Okie dokie. Now let's see, and I'll ask you maybe a few more questions offline so we can answer them at the YouTube channel. One more from someone who's been waiting very patiently. There's someone here who's talked about living with a codependent for over 20 years, and that person passed away. And I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find the question. Bear with me. Okay, I was so happily married to a codependent for 20 years before her death. No, now I am in a relationship with a recovered addict and feel so lonely at times. And the question is, seems like a come-and-go relationship. Can this work?
Well, I think the red flag is a term recovered addict. That is often used as a term inappropriately, because there's no such thing as a recovered addict. Recovery, as in codependency recovery, is a lifelong process, and there's no beginning and end point. So if I can kind of stretch it out a little bit, if this person feels recovered, they mean they stop doing their work, which points to the improbability that this relationship will ever get healthy, because recovery, and I'm also assuming the person, quote, recovered addict, is also narcissistic. Now, we don't know if that is more about the fact that they haven't worked a full-scale addiction recovery program, or they are both an addict and a narcissist.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's unlikely that the relationship will persist healthily.
Wow. Thank you. Thanks, Ross. Thanks so much. And I'm seeing now that it's the end of our time. So I think we're really going to have to hack for a return performance. This was very lots of interest in this topic. Thank you, Ross. So just before we wrap up then, I'd like to remind everyone that the replay of tonight's webinar will be posted at Psych Central's YouTube channel later this week, and the address for that is on your screen right now. And I'd like to thank everyone who attended live tonight, and also to those of you who are listening to the replay. I'd like to thank Psych Central, of course, for hosting. And finally, I left the best for last. Thank you so much, Ross. Ross Rosenberg, presenter, psychotherapist, and author. That was terrific. It really was.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'll have to ask you my questions offline.
Okay.
So, on behalf of psychcentral.com and me, Zoe Kessler, thanks everyone for joining us for tonight's webinar. Bye for now.